Hey, Browns fans, Spencer German, Cole McDaniel here with you. We consider Cole, he's actually new to the Browns Digest team. You haven't had a chance to interface with him yet, but he's here with us. He is serving in some light. I mean, he's going to help us throughout the season, but I think at this time of year especially, Cole sort of serves as our draft guru, if you will. He has his own big board that he creates every year, so we're really excited to have Cole on board with us. And we got a lot to talk about because Andrew Berry spoke at his annual pre-draft press conference today. Certainly touched on a lot of different points. Cole, I'll kick it to you. What was your overall thoughts just on what you heard from Andrew Berry today?
Well, Spencer, good to be with you here and joining you for this episode here, talking about Andrew Berry, recapping his press conference. I think the biggest thing for him is I've been hearing other media members on the radio. I've been hearing a lot of fans talk about how aggressive Andrew Berry is when it comes to free agency and when it comes to the draft. Now, I'm never going to say that Andrew Berry is complacent by any means because he's too good of a GM to be complacent, but I think he looks comfortable and relaxed going into this draft. And what I mean by that is the main thing that stuck out to me is he talked about really knowing what they want to do with pick 54 in the second round after they get through Thursday. And then they're going to maybe make some alterations to the board depending upon how it falls. And then when it gets to within the 10 picks before 54, then they're going to have an idea of who's in range to select. So
yeah,
I think the main thing, Spencer, with that is the likelihood of them trading up into the first round is probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think they're just going to sit back, maybe not even hit the phones really on Thursday night. They're just going to watch it play out, and then they'll reevaluate going into Friday. And I think that's the big thing with they're sitting pretty, they're sitting comfortable, and we're all just going to be waiting until Friday.
Yeah, and I that was a big takeaway for me as well, that he I don't want to say he gave away their plans, but when you're talking about let's get through Thursday and then we start to sort of think about what's in play for us, and then he like you alluded to, the 10 picks out is where he starts to get a better sense of, okay, what can we do? Can we trade up? Can we trade back? Who's there? Who we want? And he has had a tendency in recent years. They haven't had first round picks. They've had second round picks, but in the last 2 years of this sort of post Deshaun Watson trade, they've actually traded the second round picks both years and ended up drafting in the third round. So it's kind of been a tradition for him at this point to do that as well. So I think that's in play as you talk about just his aggressiveness or his willingness to sort of wheel and deal on draft night. So yeah, I think Browns fans certainly should expect a quiet first night, and that's probably par for the course. It would be difficult for Cleveland to jump from 54 all the way up even to like 32 if they wanted to make a selection. So I think fans kind of were expecting that, but I think we kind of got confirmation of that today. There were a few other points that he hit on, though, in relation to just this year's class and what he's seen coming out of college. And one of the big ones was, I actually asked him this question, this year, because of the COVID year of eligibility that a lot of these guys got, there are a lot of players who are older that are now entering the NFL. And I have these numbers here for you. The Browns, since Andrew Berry's been GM, the average age of players that they've drafted rounds 1 through 3 is 21.63. He doesn't draft a lot of players on the older end of things. Now, I have kind of gone back and looked, and there's several 23-year-old players that he drafted, and that was generally in like the third round that he was taking those guys. But he tends to be a GM, and the Browns philosophically tend to be a team that likes taking younger guys with a higher ceiling to sort of develop. So what do you anticipate, like how that could play a role just in how teams draft? Because, for example, like one guy that comes to mind for me, Braden Fisk out of FSU, a guy who's visited with the Browns, defensive tackle. He's 24 years old, but there's a lot of teams that have him, I think, pretty highly on their big board because he flashed really, really well at the combine.
Well, I think it depends upon the position, right? There are some positions where you have to go younger, and there are others where it's okay to go with an older guy. Obviously, the long-term stability of like a running back in the league, it doesn't last as long, right? Guys are turning 28, 29 years old, and teams are trying to get rid of them of being their star running back because they're thinking they're old. Other positions, they can be playing 33, 34 years old, and they're still almost towards the tail end of their primes, or they're starting to think about transitioning to considering retiring. So I think it just depends upon the position. Obviously, age is going to come into play, but I think the main thing that not only stood out to me from maybe his press conference today, he didn't touch on it much for this press conference, but back at the owners' meeting, something Andrew Berry talked about was really investing in the roster for the future. And this isn't a Browns team where they're not in a position where, like the Chargers, they need an overhaul at wide receiver. Same with the Bills, and the Cowboys need an overhaul in the running back room. I think when the Browns look at their roster, I think every position group, they feel pretty good about where they're sitting right now. They just want to add some guys to the depth to maybe learn this year and then actually have the chance to maybe start in 2025. So I think their mindset's probably more towards 2025 rather than 2024 in this draft. So even though he's going to want to try to get best available and age will come into play, I think it's a matter of who fits in the sense of having the higher ceiling, but needs some work in 2024, but could be ready to be something good in 2025.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to look at it too, because we know this team's championship window is kind of, as long as Deshaun Watson's here, that's kind of how we view it, right? Like however long he's here is kind of how long you think this window's open. They're getting a pretty expensive roster. There's only so much you can do to kind of maneuver around that. And so in this year where, okay, we're trying to push all the chips in the center of the table. If you can get a guy in who, even if he's a little bit older, you feel like can impact the team right now, I think that does obviously matter. And so maybe philosophically that they go against the grain in terms of what they've normally done if they really like a guy who's older, because they feel, okay, he can have an immediate impact on this roster. And then next year, maybe they revert back to, okay, we want to bring in some young guys because we have some guys that are getting older that we now kind of want to replace. I thought another interesting point he made just about the guys coming out of college. There was a question asked about just how the transfer portal has impacted development of guys. I thought that was fascinating because from my perspective, I kind of tend to think, okay, if you have a guy bouncing around from team to team, he's probably not developing the way that you maybe would expect or want him to. But he sort of said right now from his perspective, and he did kind of joke, in 5 years, I might be telling you something completely different. But right now he kind of made it seem like that's not a factor. And they still feel like guys are developing at a steady pace, even though the transfer portal is more of a factor than it's ever been for players in college.
Well, the transfer portal is a massive factor at this point. I mean, it's really changed the whole complexion of college football at this point. It's why a guy like Chip Kelly, with Ohio State came in and said, I want to coach football, right? Yeah. I don't want to have to be basically a manager. So I think that's where we're seeing that change. I think the portal can be a good thing for maybe guys who are coming from smaller schools, or they didn't quite have the maybe media coverage or the attention that they needed to really get those looks by the NFL teams. So maybe if you have somebody coming from an Ivy League school, then going to a Power 5, Big Ten school or SEC school, it helps them. For the people who are bouncing from Georgia to Texas to USC, and they're going to all these different big schools, is it necessarily helping their development? Not always. Sometimes it's just them running from competition. And it gives them opportunities to play, but at the same time, if they aren't challenging themselves to deal with competition in college, how are they going to deal with competition trying to make a 53-man roster in the NFL? So there's goods and bads of it, but it's here to stay, and it's what everybody's just going to have to deal with.
Well, and the other point that Barry made was just how the transfer portal does help them in terms of getting to know guys better, because you now have multiple sort of stash that you can go to and ask, hey, what's he like as a person? What's he like as a player? So it gives you a little bit more insight, especially as you mentioned, for maybe some of those smaller school guys who, if they bounce around to a couple of different places, you kind of get multiple perspectives on who they are as a player and a person. So I think that's kind of interesting as well. And yeah, we'll see what impact that has down the road in terms of the draft. But in terms of this year, Barry's saying they're not noticing a huge difference in development, even though I feel like it might be the opposite. Another thing you talked about was just not having first rounders these last two going on to a third year here, and how they've kind of managed this thing. I'm curious, just Cole, like based on how they've drafted and the players that they've kind of pulled out of later rounds, how do you feel they've handled that? Because Barry's going to give you the very, organizational answer of, and he brought up, even when you have first round picks, it's not always a guarantee. I think he mentioned like the hit rate on first round picks is like 50% or a little over 50% for teams. So it's not a guarantee. It's still a lottery ticket is the phrase that he used. But how do you feel they've kind of managed without having first round picks, still filling out this roster with guys in the second round and beyond?
Well, I think they've done a pretty good job in general because they've had enough guys who've stepped up. Obviously, even when Andrew Berry hasn't been aggressive, his front office, they haven't been aggressive. They've waited for guys to maybe slide down the board farther in past drafts that I have no clue how DeJuan Jones was available in the fourth round last year. They came away with DeJuan Jones. Obviously, he was a key asset this past year. You had Ronnie Hickman, a guy who went undrafted. They picked him up as a free agent. And you saw him need to step up because of the injury issues that they had in the secondary. So I think ultimately they've been able to find some diamonds in the rough. I think there are other players that maybe people are giving up on too soon, where I'm a huge David Bell guy. I was big on him coming out of that draft class. I think he's a good route runner, knows how to find space. He has sure hands. He just knows how to get to the sticks, right? Third down, fourth down, you need a first down. You can get him the football. And he had a good last couple games of this past season. Cedric Tillman, he still has room to develop. He's got the size. He just needs some work on his route running and some time to develop and sit behind Jerry Jeudy, and Amari Cooper could really help him out. So I think they have good pieces still to work with that we don't need to give up on quite yet. And that's why, and obviously something we may talk about a little bit more at some point, it's why I kind of partially have that standpoint where I'm okay if they don't take a wide receiver this year. I'm okay if they focus on other positions, offensive line, in the secondary, focus on other spots. And then when you have a first rounder next year, then you can attack Luther Burden, Emeka Egbuka. Why go for the second or third tier receivers this year when you got a first rounder again next year and you can attack the top of that group?
Yeah, that will be interesting to see how they play. Maybe that position specifically, knowing they have a first round pick finally again next year, and maybe they find more value in waiting for next year to kind of do something like that. I guess cool with that in mind, and maybe this is a good place to sort of leave this conversation off. But based on what you heard from Andrew Berry today, just based on the insight that you kind of have into this team's draft history and the needs that they have going into this draft, what do you think they're going to prioritize coming up when they're on the clock at 54? Maybe they trade back, maybe they trade up, whatever. But what do you think is going to be the first thing that they're sort of prioritizing in that range of picks?
Well, obviously, I think once they get down to those 10 picks right before them, that's when he said that they're going to have an idea of who's actually in range. They've got multiple position groups that they can target, that they know, at least for 2025, they're going to need somebody there. Me personally, I don't think there's anybody that they should really trade up for, aside from maybe if Trey Benson is there. I don't think that Trey Benson would probably get past the New York Giants.
You think running backs in play at 54 though?
I think running back could be in play.
Okay.
I really do think the Giants are the biggest threat to get Trey Benson. And if the Browns really do love him, and he's my number one running back prospect in this class, I think they'd have to make a move up. Aside from him, I don't think there's any reason to move up unless they really want to get him. I think they're more likely to move back. My honest opinion would be you could maybe go Mike Hall Jr. there at 54. He's a defensive tackle who has a lot of similar traits to Maurice Hurst. So Maurice Hurst is on a 1-year deal. You could have Hall learn behind him this year, and then Hurst, assuming he's not back in 2025, Hall fits in that spot. You could go tackle. I think Kyron Amagaji, I think he could be available there in the third still if you wanted to wait on him. But he's a guy from Yale that I feel like some of those Ivy Leaguers in the front office might have some interest in with his ability at left tackle. And he's better in the run game than in pass pro. He could get some time to develop and maybe get an opportunity to start in 2025. So few opportunities, but there's going to be multiple names at the top of the board. It's just a matter of who's in striking distance.
Well, I think that's a nice tease ahead of next week. We will we'll have a lot more content for you leading up to the draft. Even though the Browns are a first-round pick, there's still plenty to talk about. There's still a lot of roster maneuvering and management and filling out that Andrew Berry and this staff have to do. And obviously that continues next week with the draft. We have a ton of content going up over at BrownsDigest.com. I know we had a top 30 visit tracker going that it might need some update. I might have to add the last couple on there. I know I've been kind of updating that one, but we'll get that updated for you. I know we've had different draft profiles just from Cole, from Anthony Meglin, from all of us, and there's just the constant news flow of what the team is doing on a daily basis as well, including some of the commentary from Andrew Berry today, Deshaun Watson earlier in the week, Greg Newsome earlier in the week, Denzel Ward earlier in the week. So all kinds of different stuff going on. Again, BrownsDigest.com. You know where to find us. You're going to want to stay in the loop on all things Cleveland Browns. So we implore you to go do that over there. Also, stay locked in at the Browns Digest YouTube channel because we will be back. We're going to do a draft preview show similar to this, where Cole and I just kind of have a brief conversation about some of the options, some more insight into some of the players that they can look at, and some more potential rumors that we'll be hearing going into next week. And then each night after the draft sort of wraps up, we'll try to have a brief conversation as well, just about what kind of where the Browns are at and what kind of lies ahead. So again, for Cole and myself, we appreciate you guys tuning in. Stay locked in. You know where to find us again, brownsdigest.com. We'll talk to you guys next week as we get you ready for the 2024 NFL Draft.